tonight, and we're dealing with the Illuminati, secret societies, international bankers, the restorers of Israel, and the New World Order. Are they deciding our future? Many people have felt that certain things have happened in their lifetime, and yet they thought it was funny, but they never saw in the media that there was a hidden hand behind many of the political and economic decisions that are being made today. I know when I was a young fellow, quite some time ago, that I used to ask questions at school. Sir, why did all of Eastern Europe go to the communists after the last war while we had the atom bomb? Why were all the American battleships tied up at Pearl Harbor ready to be bombed? Why, sir, do we have a depression every 10 years when nobody told the sheep to stop growing wool or the apples to stop growing on the trees? Why do we always have an enemy, sir, 10 years after every war we win? Or why, sir, are we burning all our coal-fired steam engines and getting totally committed to a foreign fuel supply? You might have had many queries in your youth or today even with what's happening behind the world and in the world today. The world seems to be hurtling towards some great catastrophe, but nobody can put their finger on exactly what is happening. So with tonight's presentation, I hope that you might go away having a little bit more of an understanding of who's pulling the strings behind the scenes and what is going on. Here we see on the right-hand side the all-seeing eye on the American $1 note calling for a new world order. Here we see the forked tongues of people behind the scenes, and here we see the secret societies whereby on the lower rungs of the society people think that they're working for the benefit of humanity, that we're all going to become one big happy family, one brown race in the melting pot. But each rung of authority you go up in the secret societies, you become a little bit more aware of what is actually going on. And when you get towards the top, you find out that the ones above you are actually creating the problems in the world in order for the ones at the bottom to solve them. So what is happening whenever there's a problem, and many believe that these problems are deliberately caused in order for the remedy to be solved, and the remedy always is a centralizing of economic and political power. And at the top we see the all-seeing eye, and many in the illuminated secret societies know and feel the presence of that power, but they don't really know what that power is. Let us go and have another closer look. Here we see the Vatican on the Tiber, and here we see that Pope Clement XII condemns Freemasonry and secret societies. We have resolved and decreed to condemn and forbid such societies called Freemasonry. We condemn and forbid them by this our present constitution, which is to be considered valid forever. That was Pope Clement XII, way back in 1730. We see here that the Jesuits were formed a long time back in 1540 or 1536, and it was observed by Disraeli, the great English Jewish politician, that you never observe a great intellectual movement in Europe in which the Jews do not greatly participate. The first Jesuits were Jews, and here we see Ignatius Loyola, the Spanish Jew, with his other Jewish friends, getting the blessing of the Pope to form the Jesuits, which many believe today are the secret police of the Vatican. Then we see they got out of hand because they started with their intrigues in all of Catholic Europe, all the Catholic nations. Here we see Clement the 14th announcing his decision to abolish the Society of Jesus in 1773. Here we see them being banished from every nation in Europe. The Jesuits, after being banished from Portugal and France, received their final blow when they were expelled from Spain on the 31st of March 1767. The Jewish nation, the Jesuits were kicked out of every nation in Europe because of their intrigue in financial and political decisions being made by Catholics in high places. Here we see Adam Weishaupt. He was a Jew. Adam Weishaupt was a Jesuit, and they were banished in 1773. So in 1776, he formed the organization of the Illuminati, which means the light bearers. And this was their secret organization to control the world. At the top would be Adam Weishaupt, or some people believe he was responsible to even more secret people in Europe. And then they in turn would be responsible to others, and they would be responsible to others till the ones on the lower rung didn't really know what was going on at the top. And here we see Amschel Rothschild, the eldest son of the great banking family of Rothschilds, the Jewish banking trust, which is the most powerful banking organization in the world. And Major General Count Cherep Spiridovich said that the Rothschilds planned and directed the French Revolution via Weishaupt and Illuminism. The French Revolution had been decided 4 to 5 years ahead by the Freemasonic conventions at Wilhelmsbad, Ingolstadt and Frankfurt. The palace of Wilhelmsbad was managed by Amschel Rothschild. His mere valet, Weishaupt, also a Jew. Thus all the murders attributed rightly to the Freemasons were decided by Amschel Rothschild. Here we see the French Revolution. Some people thought it was a grassroots movement by the peasants trying off the aristocracy. The peasants were being urged on by cunningly placed orators, as is happening in racial situations around the world today, where black is played against white, or rich against poor, or management against worker. Here we see the French Revolution, where France went mad. Here we see Illuminati behind the French Revolution. 20 years before the Revolution, a rider with instructions from Adam Weishaupt in Germany was felled by lightning. On the dead man's body, the Bavarian police found plans for a revolution in France. Moses Mendelssohn, a Jewish financier, helped finance the secret societies involved. Many books have since exposed the deep design behind the French Revolution. Nestor Webster wrote a book on it, Leon Dupont wrote one, and Captain William Guy Carr also, just to speak of some. Here we see when France turned into a turmoil, the king lost his head, the aristocracy who had lived well on the riches of the land died. And one of the things that happened after the revolution, on September the 27th, 1793, the French National Assembly decreed the emancipation of the Jews in France. Wherever Napoleon conquered in Europe, the Jews were emancipated from their ghettos. We see Napoleon Bonaparte was a Freemason. In the days of his greatest prosperity, nothing was so distasteful to him as to be reminded of his Jacobin, that secret society past. He soon became a persecutor of the Pontiff, the Pope of Rome. Napoleon had commenced his career as a Freemason, and a Freemason he remained. The moment Napoleon seized power, the lodges were opened in every place. He also emancipated Jews wherever he went. Then we see the debauchery of France, that the murder and corruption, 7,000 priests lost their heads at the guillotine, the hierarchy lost their heads, the monarchy lost their heads, and Berthier, the Republican French general, captured Pius VI, and he was taken into captivity in France, where he later died in captivity. And many people saw the year when this happened of 1798. It was the end of the 1260-year prophecy of Daniel 7:25 coming true. Then we saw that Pope Pius VII excommunicated Napoleon Bonaparte in 1809. By the authority of Almighty God, we declare that you, Napoleon, Emperor of the French, have by the outrages you have committed incurred the penalty of excommunication. Here we see the result of the French Revolution. We see that 1/3 of the land was owned by the Catholic Church. It was confiscated and sold to the people for gold. 6,000 Roman Catholic priests were killed. Many say it was 7,000. The Pope was taken prisoner. The back of the Catholic Church was broken. The monarchy of France was destroyed. The Jews were emancipated in France and most of Europe. And Napoleon tried to take Palestine, which I believe was for the Jews to start a settlement there back to the Promised Land. Much of France's intelligentsia were murdered, and more secret societies set up around Europe. And there we see Napoleon there with the pyramids in Egypt on a special medal that was struck prior to him going into the Promised Land to try and take it, where the Turks drove him out. Then we saw Sir Walter Scott, the great English Englishman, Sir Walter Scott, claimed the Illuminati behind the French Revolution. Sir Walter Scott points out that the events leading up to the French Revolution were all created by the money barons, the Illuminati, whose agents, Freemasons, then led the mob in creating the famous Reign of Terror. Then we saw, why did this break out in France and not in other places in Europe? Some would say that in England the people were taught respect for each other because of the preachings of the Wesley brothers and the Methodists there. But many believe that when France killed 100,000 Protestants on the Bartholomew Night massacre, then they lost the protection of God and they took a debauched downhill ride until it resulted in the tragedy of the French Revolution, when mayhem broke out throughout society. And there we see the Pope, Pontifex Maximus, taking the cross and the sword against all those that disagreed with him. And France reaped the whirlwind from the seeds of intolerance she had sowed against those who wanted to read the Bible. Then we see the banking house of the Rothschilds, the four Rothschilds houses of Europe. A Jew states that the Jewish financiers rule the world through secret societies. The meaning of the history of the last century is that today 300 Jewish financiers, all masters of lodges, rule the world. Here we see the uprisings in Europe. In France in 1830, when mayhem broke out, it was known to have been caused in certain circles by underhand Freemasonry. The rabbi claims that Freemasonry is Jewish. Freemasonry is a Jewish establishment whose history, grades, official appointments, passwords and explanations are Jewish from beginning to end. Rabbi Dr. Isaac M. Wise, quoted by General Ludendorff. Here we see the great Jewish Prime Minister of England, Lord Beaconsfield, known as Lord Beaconsfield. His real name was Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Disraeli admits a secret power governs the world. The world is governed by very different personages than those who are not behind the scenes would imagine. Here we see another Jew, Karl Marx. The Jew Disraeli claims the Jews behind the 1848 revolution. That mighty revolution which is at this moment preparing in Germany, and which will be in fact the second and greater Reformation, and of which so little is yet known in England, is developing entirely under the auspices of the Jews. That was Disraeli's statement. Here we see the principles of Marxism, Friedrich Engels, another Jew, and some of the points and the 10 points to socialise the West was a central bank of issuance in each country, centralised government, centralised abolition of inheritance through taxation, a progressive income tax, the ending of private-owned lands, etc., and, as it says here, a national bank with a monopoly of banking operations, public ownerships of railroads, communication, etc. Here we see the Protestant statement and form before revolutions occurred. At the outbreak of the revolution in 1845, I found myself in relation with a Jew who informed me 8 to 10 days in advance of all the revolutions which were to break out upon every point of Europe. All these grand movements of oppressed people, so-called, etc., are managed by half a dozen individuals who give their advice to the secret societies of Europe. Some people might think this is what's happening with the indigenous people and the great so-called million-person march over the Sydney Harbour Bridge. But here we see in Europe the mayhem was always caused by people who were trying to bring about a new world order and destroy the old world order where the church ruled the state. We see the same mayhem across Europe in many cities. That's where Vienna was burnt. Then we see Disraeli in older life when he said, Disraeli traces revolution to secret societies led by Jews. The influence of the Jews may be traced in the last outbreak of the destructive principle in Europe. The aberration of property is proclaimed by the secret societies which form provisional governments, and men of Jewish race are found at the head of every one of them. Disraeli, Prime Minister of England. Now we see Giuseppe Mazzini. He was one of the head Illuminati men of Europe, but this is what he said. Mazzini, the Illuminist, felt a secret power above him. We form an association of brothers in all points of the globe. We aim at the emancipation of humanity. We wish to break every kind of yoke, yet there is one that is unseen, that can hardly be felt, yet that weighs on us. Whence comes it? Where is it? No one knows, or at least no one tells. The association is secret, even for us, the veterans of the secret societies. Then we see the revolution in Europe again, 1870. General Albert Pike. Albert Pike lived in America. He was one of the head Freemasons of the world, and yet he was an Illuminist and a Satanist, and he actually communicated with Mazzini through crystal balls. They could communicate with each other across the Atlantic Ocean before the invention of the telephone. Here we see Pope Pius IX condemning Freemasonry as from the synagogue of Satan. Pope Pius IX condemns Jewish Freemasonry due to its enormous extension and its nowadays very visible collusion with international Jewish finance. Freemasonry has indeed become the synagogue of Satan. As such, it provided funds for the Russian Revolution. Here we see that during these revolutions, the priests were taken out and shot, and the people reacted and shot. Here is an archbishop being shot by the revolutionary troops. Here we see the papacy falls and Jews freed. In 1870, the papacy received another wound to the one it received in 1798. It lost its secular power, and it was denied its place as a nation. But it fell in the revolution of 1870. 11 days after Rome fell, on the 2nd of October 1870, the Jews, by a royal decree, were given the freedom which the papacy had denied them for over 1500 years. The last ghetto in Europe at that time was dismantled. So the Catholic Church was always on the receiving end of these great European revolutions. Freemasonry, the Illuminati, and certain Jews were always involved. And here we see the colonel, the residence of the King of Italy. He took that in 1870 when Italy was made into a nation. The new king was a Freemason, and the Pope was restricted to the Vatican. And here we see the king and the Pope with the keys. Pius IX is restricted, and he loses his secular power. Then we see some of the results in France of the 1870 revolution and war. The devastation was tremendous. And here we see leaders of the First International urging people to unite around the world as brothers. At this time we see Pius XIII, or Leo XIII, sees Freemasonry as God's enemy. Let us remember that Christianism and Freemasonry are essentially incompatible. Let us therefore expose Freemasonry as the enemy of God and of the Church. December the 8th, 1892. Then we see here what happened in Russia. The Jews at that time, the Jewish revolutionaries, murdered the Tsar of Russia. There he is, after being mortally wounded, being carted away. The Jewish revolutionary leaders were determined to continue their movement. Their terrorist groups committed one outrage after another. In 1866, they made their first attempt on the life of Alexander II. They tried to murder him a second time in 1879. The conspirators hatched their next plot in the home of Jewess Hesia Helfman. The Tsar was murdered in 1881. Pawns in the Game, page 64. There was the reaction to their assassination, and the poor Jews who were innocent and had nothing to do with it, they were dragged through the streets. And the Russians tend to attack all Jews, both good and bad. And this is what happened. The assassination of the Russian Tsar in 1881 caused widespread resentment, which was expressed by a spontaneous outbreak of violence against the Jewish population. They were restricted to what they call the Pale of the Settlement, which was in western Russia around the Ukraine, and no Jew was allowed outside of that area. And they were forced into the army. Good and bad Jews were heaped together by the anti-Semitism that ruled in Russia at the time. There is the mob dragging this poor Jew who may have been innocent, but all of them were persecuted. The Jew, on the other hand, their leaders, felt that they were the promised, or they were the chosen people of God, and the rest of the world were what they called goyim, or cattle, and that they had a right, through money and all other devious means, of subduing them and returning themselves to Israel. And they were using the money power of the world as being controlled by the Jews for some time. But you can see in some of the evidence we've seen today that the Jews have been you can see in some of the evidence we've had today that the Jewish financiers have been involved as well. Here we see some Jews, the Jewish Pale within Tsarist Russia. The Jews were not allowed out into this area, which was around the Ukraine, around Kiev. The May laws confined the Jews to the Pale of the settlement. After the Tsar's assassination, the Russian government restricted Jews to live in an area of Western Russia. The Tsar's report stated, during the last 20 years, the Jews have not only possessed themselves of every trade and business, but also of a great part of the land. With a few exceptions, they have, as a body, devoted their attention not to enriching the country, but to defrauding the Russian people by their wiles. As a result of these anti-Semitic laws, the Jewish international bankers tried to bankrupt Russia. Then we see massive immigration of the Jews from Russia into New York, the Lower East Side of New York. Pogroms in Russia, that's persecution, after the Tsar's assassination in 1881, compelled many Jews to immigrate to America. And here we see them arriving in New York, the land of the free, where they settled in the Lower East Side of New York. And there they are, Russian Jews flocked to New York's Lower East Side. And there they are with their buying and selling and their homes. And they migrated there because this is the scene of a poor Russian with some of his dead family. Sorry, he's a Jew with some of his dead family here after the house has been ransacked by pogroms. As I said, the mad mobs differentiated not between good or bad. All were categorized into evil groups. Here we see Herzl. Many of the Jews were sick of what was going on, and so they yearned to return to the Promised Land. Herzl was the man who was the driving power behind the Zionist movement. And then one of the Lord Rothschild, or Baron Edmond de Rothschild, the French part of the family, was the driving power behind financing the establishment of Zionism in Palestine, or the Jews' return. Then we see what happened. The bankers start the Boer War to control the gold. Here we see Lord Milner, an English Jew, with an English army officer. The next year saw the publication of Mr. Hilary Belloc. He was a Roman Catholic book, The Jews. In this book, Mr. Belloc declares that the South African War was openly and undeniably provoked and promoted by Jewish interests because they wanted the gold that was on the Boer land over the Orange River. And that's why they went to war, and much British blood was spilt. Judo-Masonry and Catholicism wrestle for world power. There are only two great powers, Judo-Masonry in the service of world Jewry, which basically controls the Western world, and the Church in the hands of Peter's successor. Those two powers are at war, face to face, as though fighting an endless duel. Monsignor Joanne, he's a Catholic bishop from Chile. Here we see the fight between Catholicism and Freemasonry is to the death. The fight taking place between Catholicism and Freemasonry is a fight to the very death, ceaseless and merciless. This is from a stone inscription on the Masonic Grand Orient and Supreme Council of France, recorded in Bulletin of the Grand Orient of France, page 183, 1892. Here we see Freemasons call for fight against the papacy. The fight against the papacy is a social necessity and constitutes the constant duty of Freemasonry. The world conquest through world government. The protocols of the learned elders of Zion. They were circulated through the British Empire and in Russia and certain other places over the last 100 years. The Jew denies their existence, but many believe it is their master plan and blueprint for the subversion of the world. A Jew exposes their secret plan to overthrow the world. In the desires of a terrible and formidable sect, you have only reached the first stages of the plans it has formed for that general revolution which is to overthrow all thrones, all altars, annihilate all property, efface all law and end by dissolving all society. That was Burrell, who himself was a Jew. There we see next in the early part of the century was the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. The Russians were defeated. It was a superpower of Europe, and many people wondered how the Japanese, whose technology was only consisted of bamboo spears and bamboo shields, and here they managed to get their hands on steel battleships and cannon and ammunition in order to take over, to defeat Russia. Here is the Russian fleet being bombed to bits by the Japanese fleet. The Japanese fleet, many ask, where did it come from? Who financed it? Well, it was financed by the Jews. And why the war took place in the East, the Tsar was the Jewish bankers financed Japan in the Russian-Japanese War of 1905. The Tsar was a virulent anti-Semite because he had a personal axe to grind with the Schiffs, the Warburgs and the Rothschild banking dynasties. They were all international Jewish bankers who were already planning a revolution in Russia. Jacob Schiff was giving immense financial aid to the Japanese against the Russians. He was decorated by the emperor after the Russo-Japanese War in 1905 because Jacob Schiff brought the banking to Japan, and he financed the steel battleships. He financed the steel battleships of the Japanese Navy. And also, why did the war take place in 1905 in the East? Because out in the West, in Leningrad and Moscow, they started a revolution there, and in order to overthrow the Russian government, they had a decoy out in the East by financing the Japanese to attack Russia in the Pacific, around Vladivostok. And there we see the unsuccessful revolution in the West. It failed in 1905, and some of the posters at the time, you can see the Russians put more anti-Semitic propaganda, a Polish attack on Trotsky. Here we see them sitting on the heads, the skulls of the Russian people, a Jew with a revolver. Anti-Semitism prevailed in Russia before the 1917 revolution. Russians hate Jews individually and collectively. To say in Russia you are a friend of the Jews is to place yourself beyond the pale of Christianity as understood in the Tsar's dominions. Read Russia by John Foster Fraser, page 163. Then we see a Jew speaks of Zion's future plans. Herzl, the Zionist Congress, the English-Uganda proposition, the future world war, the peace conference, were with the help of England, a free and Jewish Palestine will be created. Here is a Jew who is saying that after the war, which many believe the Jewish financiers financed all sides to destroy Christendom, then we saw that they would get Palestine. Here's Victor Marsden, who translated the famous protocols that said this. Then we see another Jew. He was a Rockefeller. But at the same time, before the war, the super bankers of America formed tax-exempt foundations for themselves, while at the same time they brought in the graduated taxation scale for all their relations or friends or all their other people in society. They themselves and their friends had special tax-exempt foundations where they paid no income tax. What they did was pay half their billions and billions every year away to themselves every year, and then they used it to influence education and scientific research and drug company research, that they would influence and control the entire thought of the world through financing education. And then in their controlled media, they would hail themselves as philanthropists for giving half their income away to themselves every year and denying the American tax people their right to revenue. And here we have Warburg, another Jew. The Federal Reserve is privately owned by a handful of banking families. In 1913, a central bank of issuance was set up in America, where one bank would control the amount of credit in circulation, and also it would control the interest rates of the nation. And it is still the case today. But yet this bank is privately owned, mainly by Jewish connections. It is in violation of the American Constitutional Article 1, Section 8, paragraph 5, and from 1922 the billions in profits go to themselves. They set up the Federal Reserve banking system in America. They then had access to create money out of thin air to finance the entire First World War. And some people think it wasn't a coincidence that the war broke out straight after the Federal Reserve Bank in America, as one of Karl Marx's 10 points to socialise the West, had been brought in. Here we see that Britain went to war, and here we see young men from the British Commonwealth about to have their lives terminated on no man's land as they go over the top. Millions of young men died. Then we see in Palestine, here we see the fiasco of the landing in Gallipoli, and here we see Australians and New Zealanders going over the top to die. One day, 850 New Zealanders died in one day. Here we see the war around Jerusalem, and here we see General Allenby riding into Jerusalem when Jerusalem fell. And there we saw the planes flying, the British warplanes flying over Jerusalem at the time, and in many English churches they sang a hymn that was similar to Jeremiah 31:5. As birds flying, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending also he will deliver it, and passing over it he will preserve it. Many people believe the birds flying that relieved Jerusalem were the British Air Force, and the Turks panicked and Jerusalem fell to General Allenby without a shot being fired. And Allenby, his name in the Arabic meant prophet from the east, and the Arabs struck a special coin after the war for that. But many cynics and strategists believe that why were the Australian and New Zealand, the French and the Indian and the English fighting in the Dardanelles at Gallipoli? Why were they there? Many people believe they were there to draw off the Turkish troops to the north and to enable Allenby to conquer Jerusalem for someone after the war to occupy. Then we find in Russia at the time of the war, the terrible revolution broke out, and Trotsky, his real name was Leon Bronstein. It wasn't Trotsky at all. He was a Jew. Trotsky and his Jewish revolutionaries detained by the Canadian government. The plan Jacob Schiff had made to allow Trotsky and his revolutionary leaders to return to Russia went astray when they were detained by Canadian government officials in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Schiff immediately protested the Canadian government, who instantly let them go through the British naval blockade in the Atlantic and on to destroy Russia. Kitchener, the great British general, dies when a battleship he was on. He was going to aid Russia, but certain powers in the world, they believe, didn't want him to do so. A decision was reached to send Lord Kitchener to Russia for the purpose of reorganising the Russian military forces against Bolshevism. Lord Kitchener sailed from Scapa Flow aboard the HMS Hampshire. She was mysteriously sunk during the night of June the 5th, 1916. The German military stated that it had nothing to do with the sinking. Some people believe that people in the know and secret societies had placed a bomb on that ship to get rid of Kitchener because they knew that they planned a revolution in Russia. Here we see some of the documentation. Jewish bankers financed the Russian Revolution in 1917. At school, I was taught that the Russian Revolution was a movement of the working class people to better their conditions. But after the revolution, we find out that the Russian conditions were twice as bad as what they were beforehand. And on April the 17th, Jacob Schiff publicly declared that it was thanks to his financial support that the revolution in Russia had succeeded. Today it is estimated that Jacob's grandson, John Schiff, by his grandson John Schiff, that the old man, that's Jacob, sank about $20 million into the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. Many Bolsheviks are Jews according to Jewish sources. This is from a Jewish chronicle. There is much in the fact of Bolshevism itself, in the fact that so many Jews are Bolshevik, in the fact that the ideas of Bolshevism at many points are consonant with the finest ideals of Judaism. You see, the Jews think that they're the chosen people of the world and that they should have Palestine and that all the other people in the world should live on under communism or under socialism. And they are called by the Jew goyim, or cattle, or common herd. Now we see what happened in the Russian front. During the First World War, after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian army collapsed and the Eastern German army was freed from fighting on the Eastern Front, and Germany's greatest peril had been relieved, and that was that they hated to fight a war on two fronts, and they were fighting the Allies in the West and the Russian Orthodox in the East. And once the revolution collapsed, the Russian armed forces, and pandemonium and chaos broke out, the Eastern army of the Germans managed to come over, and here the Allies were suddenly confronted by two German armies of formidable size. Then we see that Lord Rothschild obtained from Lord Balfour, a retired Prime Minister of England, what they call the Balfour Agreement. And it was where Jewish finance pressurised the English into promising them Palestine for Jewish immigration after the war. And this is what it read: "I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine." Get that? "Or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist movement, signed Lord Balfour." And there we see Lord Balfour. And so Jewish money said to them, and this is what is believed that happened, because the German Eastern Army was now going to hit the Western Front, then the Allies were in serious trouble. They needed America into the war. And many believe that the Zionists said that if you give us Palestine, which General Allenby has just conquered, for Jewish settlement, we will persuade Woodrow Wilson, the President of America, who had been elected on the belief that he would keep American boys out of the war. Then they said they would be able to persuade him to bring America into the war to help the West. And the excuse was, because he'd been elected on the basis of keeping America out of the war, the sinking of the Lusitania was used as an excuse to breed hatred against Germany to bring it into the war. And this is from Captain William Carr and his investigation. "It can be assumed that the SS Lusitania was sunk to provide the necessary incident to justify the change of American policy, just as Pearl Harbor was used as an excuse for America to enter World War II. And what happened? American public opinion was changed overnight when Money Powers newspaper, who are no longer interested in telling you the truth, they're only interested in conditioning you into believing what they want you to believe. They presented the case of the evil Germans and that the Lusitania was sunk by them. Well, the Lusitania had many Americans on board, but it had much ammunition, which the Germans knew about too, for the Allied armies. Then we see here that Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was murdered by the hidden hand. Lawrence of Arabia was a hero in his own right, and Lawrence was loved by the Arabs. He was an Englishman, and he persuaded the Arabs to fight with the British against the Turks on the basis that they would get Palestine. But here we see people up at the head of the conspiracy now saying that the Jews were going to have Palestine. And so they had to get rid of Lawrence of Arabia. And in Mullen's History of the Jews, page 153, we read, "Desmond Stewart and other English writers have recently compiled evidence that T. Lawrence's death in a motorcycle accident was really cold-blooded murder. The Jews understood that their plans to take over the Arab lands could never be carried out as long as Lawrence was alive to testify to the pledges of territorial integrity which the British made to the Arabs in exchange for their support during World War I. They used to know his habits, and that was every Sunday morning when Lawrence was back in England, he got on his Indian motorbike and went for a drive down this country lane. One day when he went down there was a thin wire rope across the road, and of course it broke his neck. Then we see the Americans coming into the war, as they had told. America came into the war en masse. Hundreds of thousands of American boys were shipped into Europe to oppose the German army coming over from the east after the collapse of communism in Russia. Then we see the Prime Minister of England at that time, David Lloyd George. He made this statement. He acted, Prime Minister claims Zionists helped bring US into the war for Palestine. He acted to gain the support of American Jewry, that's all the big Jewish bankers on Wall Street in New York, and that he had a definite promise from the Zionist leaders that if the Allies committed themselves to a national home for the Jews in Palestine, they would do their best to rally Jewish sentiment and support throughout the world to the Allied cause, i.e. bring America into the war on the Allies' side. That was in The Controversy of Zion by Douglas Reed, page 269. And that, friends, is exactly what happened. There is the German High Command. Freemasons in Germany, immediately, once that deal was planned, and Palestine was promised to the Jews, the German military supplies were cut off by Freemasons in secret positions. And revolution was bred in the streets of Germany. So the German army was being stabbed in the back. And General Ludendorff, the highest officer in the German army, he said, during the war, German Freemasonry, quite in harmony with the politics of the World Lodge, who wanted to control the world through creating wars and then selling them the remedies, which would centralise political and economic power into their hands, yielded, according to their own records, the field to the enemy and remained temporised. Destruction of Freemasonry by General Ludendorff. And here we see a field lodge in the German army on the Western Front. You can see their symbol there. So the Freemasons were working to build a better world in which religion would have no part. They felt, remember, at the lower rungs, the ordinary Freemasons were working towards a better world. But each rung of authority they went up, they finally realised, the ones that made it, that the ones at the top were creating the problems in order for the ones at the bottom to solve. Ludendorff claims that lodges played a role in the German Revolution. During the Revolution of Germany, that's immediately after the First World War, and the Revolution itself, the lodges number 11 and 7 played a special role. Destruction of Freemasonry, General Ludendorff, and there he is on the left. Here we see at the peace process after the war at Versailles, Italy only entered the world that the Pope would not be allowed at the peace conference after the war. Pope excluded from the peace conference. I have insisted, and I insist again, that the Pope was expressly excluded by the Secret Pact of London in 1915 from future deliberations in the Council of Peace. Archbishop Hensley, Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster. It is reported that Italy entered the war on the Allied side on the condition that the Pope would be banned from participating at the peace conference after the war. Here we see the peace conference at Versailles. The international bankers nominated the conference, which culminated in the Treaty of Versailles. This is proved by the fact that in January 1919, Mr. Paul Warburg arrived in Paris to head the American delegation. Warburg was a German Jew who migrated to America. His brother, Max Warburg, arrived to head the German delegation. And then we see they sold the world the remedies to the war that they created. The Jewish international bankers behind the League of Nations. The League of Nations is a Jewish idea. We created Jerusalem will someday become the capital of the world peace. What we Jews have accomplished we owe to the genius of our immortal leader, Theodor Herzl. Now, there is the building of the League of Nations. The first League of Nations president was a Jew. The first president of the League of Nations was a Jew called Hyman. Now we see what happened, the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference under Jewish influence. The leaders from the three main Allied nations all took their Jewish advisors to Versailles in France. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of England, was advised by Jewish Sir Philip Sassoon, a direct descendant of the Rothschilds. Clement, Premier of France, was advised by Jewish George Mandel. His real name wasn't Mandel, it was Rothschild. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, was advised by the Jew Bernard Baruch. And here we see Clement, Woodrow Wilson here, and David Lloyd George there, Prime Minister of Great Britain. And here we see, at that time, the Zionist Wiseman chides Britain. Here we see, we will establish ourselves in Palestine, whether you, the British, like it or not. You can hasten our arrival or you can equally retard it. It is, however, better for you to help us so as to avoid our constructive powers being turned into a destructive power which will overthrow the world. So they were financing revolution and they were financing the nations at the top. And here we see, after the war, Winston Churchill visited Palestine. And here we see the first Jewish settlements arrived under the protection of the British mandate for Palestine. And here we see Jews arriving. Here's Sir Alfred Mond, a Privy Councillor, Chaim Wiseman, etc. And there we see lots of Jews there arriving in Palestine. And here we see the Jew said, Rome is the greatest enemy of Bolshevism. A Jew, Sir Alfred Mond, the former Minister of Health of England, revealed in his English Review, Rome is the greatest enemy of Bolshevism. Bernard Baruch controlled the finances for the war. The Jewish financier, Elder Baruch, was during the entire period of the First War, chairman of the War Industries Board, which was invested with despotic authority over the production and sale of everything to the warring nations. It is said he made himself $400 million by giving his friends lucrative war contracts. That's from the book The Rothschild Money Trust, page 66, by George Armstrong. And there we see the Jew Bernard Baruch. Then we see one of the results of the First World War, that like the French Revolution, the king lost his head. Here we see the Russian king Tsar lost his head. The king of, or the Kaiser of Germany, Wilhelm II, he lost his throne, and Habsburgs of Austria, after a great line through history, he lost his throne, so all the kings of Europe, many of them lost their thrones. And here we see now what actually the results, we saw the results of the French Revolution. Now we see the results of the First World War. The youth of all the Christian nations dead and maimed. Millions and millions of the Christian nations' youth were dead and maimed. The Christian nations in huge debt to the Jewish bankers. The Jewish bankers had written out bits of paper and given them to the nations, and then the poor survivors of the war had to pay interest on it. The monarchies of Germany, Austria and Russia were destroyed. All of Russia destroyed by communist revolution. Communist revolution erupts in Europe. The League of Nations was created as a remedy to the war. The Bank of International Settlement was formed as a remedy to the war. And Lord Balfour Agreement gives Palestine to the Jews. And the Orthodox Church in Russia is attacked. And anti-Semitism is outlawed in Russia. Here we see Lord Chief Justice of England making this statement. The 1990 Privy Council of England composed of Jews. It was headed by Lord Rothschild, Sir Edwin Montagu, Sir Edgar Spear, Sir Matthew Nathan, Sir Alfred Mond, Sir Harry Samuel, Sir Ernest Cassel. He was the founder of the London School of Economics. And Earl Reading, that's Rufus Isaac, who we see there, Lord Chief Justice of England. The English don't control England. The Jews are controlling England, and they were allowed back into England under Cromwell in about 1660. Before that they were banished in 1295 from England, but they were allowed back in under Cromwell, and it was a short time before, through their money, they owned the whole of England. The Jewish bankers bankrolled the Russian Revolution. The following list shows names of some of the international Jewish bankers who bankrolled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Jacob Schiff, Grondenheim, Max Brottung, Felix Warburg, Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff, S.H. Henner, Lazare Brothers, Gunsborg Bank, Speyer and Co., Nyon Baron of Stockholm, Rothschilds of London. Under Jewish pressure, this report was destroyed by the US State Department. And here we see Lord Alfred Milner, the wealthy Jew who was one of the Rothschilds' agents in taking their money into Russia. Remember, he was in South Africa when they wanted the gold? Here we see Trotsky, whose real name is Bronstein, and there's his mum and dad, Anna Bronstein and David Bronstein. Then we see another cartoon depicting the Jews during the Russian Revolution, dealing in the skulls of humanity. And here we see a list of the first Supreme Soviet. 56 of the 59 members on the first Supreme Soviet were Jews under assumed names. Now that's history. And the evidence I've been given you is taken from previous published material. I'm only piecing it together to give you what I consider to be an accurate assessment of what's happening behind the scenes, why we have wars and depressions, why we have debt which maim our productive capacities. Here we see communist Russia outlaws anti-Semitism. All these Jews on the first Soviet, special concern for the Jewish people has characterized the Soviet Union since its birth. In 1917, the infant socialist government made anti-Semitism a crime. Then we see the Jewish banker Jacob Schiff. Not a good picture, but he didn't allow many pictures to be taken of him because they did their work in secret. That's why most of you have never heard of them. The Jewish banker Jacob Schiff gets the Russian gold. Remember, his grandson said that he sunk $20 million into the Russian Revolution. Now his sister, Mr. Bakhmetev, the late Russian imperial ambassador to the United States, tells us that the Bolsheviks, after victory, transferred 600 million rubles in gold between the years 1918 and 1922 to the Kunlob and Company Bank, that's Schiff's firm in New York, a goodly improvement on his original investment of $50 million. Stalin was of the Jewish race. Stalin himself for a long time was regarded as a Georgian, but it has been revealed that he belonged to the Jewish race. For Durgachvili, which is his name, son of Dao, and Dao is a small island in Persia where many banished Portuguese Marano Jews migrated, who later settled in Georgia, Russia. And there is Stalin in a Jewish regalia having a special Jewish ceremony before they had a big purge in Russia where they killed many Russian army officers and people throughout the system. They had periodical clean-outs to keep themselves in power. There we see the Russian Revolution, and there we see the poverty of the results, the sad trauma and the tragic conditions that Russia found themselves in. Then we see Judaism is anti-Christian and controls Bolshevism. There is much in the fact of Bolshevism itself and in the fact that so many Jews are Bolsheviks, and the fact that the ideals of Bolshevism at many points are consonant with the finest ideas of Judaism. Fundamentally, Judaism is anti-Christian. And here's one of the Spartacus was his nickname or his code name, and he was responsible for many of the revolutions that broke out in Europe at the same time as the Russian Revolution broke out. Here we see the Russian Revolution planned at a Masonic Congress in 1889. History will be likely to give prominence to plans for the destruction of Russia formulated at the Masonic Congress held in Brussels. Trotsky was a Freemason. The international banker Jacob Schiff protected the Jew and Freemason Trotsky, whose real name was Bronstein. Trotsky married the daughter of the Jewish international banker Zhivatovich. Okay. Then we see the British government knew of secret Jewish plans. Here's from a special British government white paper on Russia No. 1, 1919. One of their spies said, unless Bolshevism is nipped in the bud, it is bound to spread. over the whole world, as it is organised and worked by Jews, whose object is to destroy for their own ends the existing order of things, break down the old order and bring in the new world order. Here we see Winston Churchill. Churchill knew of secret Jewish plots to control the world. This is a statement he made. This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia and Bela Kun in Hungary and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany and Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been readily growing. Winston Churchill. There is a power somewhere so organised, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive that they better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America. There he is there. He was taken as the director. He was the Chancellor of a big university in the east of America, and he was put by them up to represent the Democratic Party, and of course they financed him and put him in as their puppet. And here is one of his advisors, and his advisor is Colonel House. He's a Dutch Jew, and he told him exactly what to say and what to think. And of course Henry Ford, you've all heard of Henry Ford, but he actually wrote a book about these international Jews, and this is what we see. The meaning of history of the last century is that today 300 Jewish financiers, all masters of lodges, rule the world. Here we see the book he wrote called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Scotland Yard's knew about it, the Jews were behind the revolution. There is now definite evidence that Bolshevism is an international movement controlled by Jews. Communications are passed between the leaders in America, France, Russia and England with a view to concerted action. Director of the Intelligence of Scotland Yard. Here is another one. First and second 1918 German socialist governments were loaded with Jews. 11 Jews took power in Germany after the revolution in 1918. All 11 were Freemasons and belonged to the secret lodge number 11 from Munich. Here we see Rosa Luxemburg, the Jewess. Jewish publication claims revolution used for world dominion. World revolution, which some of us may live to see, is and must remain our concern, and its preparation must be in our hands. By means of this world revolution, the power of Jewry will be established over all nations of the world. Here we see Bela Kun, the leader of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. The Jew Bela Kun brings revolution to Hungary. In the spring of 1919, Bela Kun usurped power in Hungary. Bela Kun's dictatorship lasted only 3 months, but during that time, tens of thousands of Christians, they were Roman Catholics, were ruthlessly murdered. The New International Yearbook of 1919 says in part, the government of Bela Kun was composed almost exclusively of Jews. And then we see Pope Pius IX again. Pope Pius condemns communism. Communism is intrinsically perverse, and it cannot be admitted that those who wish to serve the Christian civilization may in any way cooperate with it. Papal encyclical. Now we see what happened in Germany after the war. I met a man in Canada once. I was introduced to him as doctor, and I said, what have you done your PhD in? He said, I did a PhD on how many wheelbarrowfuls of money were needed to buy a loaf of bread in Germany after the war. I said, pity you didn't do a PhD, sir, or doctor, on who to switch the printing press on, because you can't have wheelbarrowfuls of money unless somebody switches the printing press on. And someone, in order to destroy Germany, switched the printing press on. And here they are, putting them in bucket loads and bucket loads. And here we see the soup kitchens in Germany. Chaos in Germany. Now, after the revolution in Germany, where Luxemburg, the Jewess, was in control, she was shot by the remains of the German army. And this is one of the reasons that Hitler detested the Jews because he blamed all Jews because he knew what was happening in Russia and Hungary and in his own country, Austria and Germany. But here we see in England on another front, the Jewish banker Castle finances the economic education. The Jewish millionaire banker Sir Ernest Cassell paid the money for the building of the London School of Economics. And here we see a glass-stained window at the London School of Economics. And here it is, we see a wolf in a sheep's clothing there as their emblem. What does that mean? It's called the Fabian Society, where the Fabian socialists are taking the world. You can see these ones with sledgehammers are recreating the world according to their utopian state. And it's called the Fabian Society because Fabian was a Roman general who never took a city in a frontal attack. He always took them very slowly by starving them out by water, restricting the water or the food supply, so he took them indirectly. And the Fabian socialists are taking us over indirectly as well. So there's no real difference between a communist state or us being run by 200 big multinationals. So let's go on. Here we see one of the Fabian socialists was John Maynard Keynes. And he suggested that we get out of the depression which was caused by taking money out of circulation by printing more money or getting it from the bankers. And that was all right, but it put us further into debt. Every time we borrowed $1 million from the bankers, we could spend it, and it made the goods go round, but there was a shadow of debt attached to it, which they had to pay the interest on the next year out of their taxation. So really it was like eating your arm when you were hungry. It tasted okay, but after you'd eaten it, you never had it again. And inflation was actually caused. Then we had the Roaring 20. Remember, the Federal Reserve Bank was put into operation in America in 1914, and from that central point, which was one of Karl Marx's 10 points to socialise the West, we saw the bankers deliberately expand credit by putting plenty of easy money in society at low interest rates. The economy predictably boomed, and during the boom all the businesses went into hock to the banks in order to put their property up as collateral to the banks in order to expand to keep up with the boom. But the bankers knew that the fish was on the hook then, because all the bankers took all the property as collateral. So then it was in their interest to call. We had the boom of the 20s, and then we had the Wall Street crash, and all the businesses fell into the bankers' hands. And we saw soup kitchens again, unemployment lines, and men in a land of plenty having very little to eat, because the money of that nation had been manipulated by international financiers on Wall Street for their own ends, so all the property of America would fall into their hands. And remember, they got them on the hook during the boom because the businesses went into hock to the bankers during the boom in order to expand their business to keep up with the growth. And then when the depression came, the bankers knocked on the door and took over their assets. Okay. Then we see the dole lines and social unrest and cars sold very cheaply, people jumping out of skyscrapers, and the reaction to this social unrest in Europe raised Mussolini, the Catholic boy, took over in Italy. And of course, he banned Freemasonry. The first thing he did, he abolished Freemasonry, and Hitler also abolished Freemasonry in Germany. And then we see the Spanish Civil War took place. There we see the Catholic priests were fighting to get law and order back from what many believed the Jewish bankers were financing the Spanish government, which was democratically elected. And we saw the law and order return to Spain after the Civil War, where the church got back on control. And here we see the Windsors meeting Adolf Hitler. He resigned his crown of England for what they said, Mrs. Simpson, but there was more to it than that. He knew that things behind the scenes, he didn't want to spend his life as a puppet controlled by international financiers who were working against the interest of the people. He went to Wales once during the Depression, and they'd whitewashed all the walls where Edward VIII was to walk down, and he wasn't meant to go off it. but being the man he was, he walked up a grubby side alley and said, I want to see the people as they are. And he knocked on a door, and an old lady came to the door, and there was the King of England. And he said, can I come in for a cup of tea? And she said, I haven't got any food in the house. Why? Because the bankers had restricted the food supply. But you notice there were plenty of money about when wars are to be fought. But they were starving the people. So when I often wondered why why he was anti-Semitic, as they say. I always asked questions at school and never got a satisfactory answer. But there was a reason why Hitler was anti-Semitic, because he knew what the international Jewish bankers were doing. He knew that they were causing the revolution in Russia and in Germany and all the other European nations. But he made the mistake of hating all Jews, both good and bad. He never differentiated them, and he condemned them as an entire race. And here the Catholic priests saw Hitler as God's providence. God's holy providence has provided that in a decisive hour he, Hitler, be entrusted with the leadership of the German people. There is the old church swastika, as we saw last night. Now we see the teeming million of Germany's troops are now armed to fight against Bolshevism and the Jewish money power. Catholic paper claims Hitler or Nazi movement would save humanity from the Jews. The Nazi movement for freeing the world from the Jews is a movement for the renaissance of human dignity. The all-wise and almighty God is behind this movement. Father Franjo Kralik in Zagreb, a Catholic newspaper, 1941. So there was a reaction. Nazism was a reaction where the church got on the bandwagon, saw the obvious evils of Freemasonry, the Jewish money power and communism and Bolshevism, and they united. Hitler was a Catholic, and here we see him meeting one of the heads of the Catholic Church. Catholic Church unites with Catholic-controlled state to fight a common enemy, i.e. Jewish money power, communism and Freemasonry. Catholicism and Judeo-Masonry vie for world dominion. The papacy and Freemasonry, those are the two powers active throughout the world, and each is seeking to dominate it. Either Roman Catholicism will lift us up again to the level of Christian civilization, or else Judeo-Masonry will drag us down the path of barbarism and decadent paganism. The whole world oscillates between the two, Christendom and paganism, or what we could say Catholicism and communism, or the Jewish Freemasonic power. Here we see Hitler. Hitler claimed the Jewish financiers want another war. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Adolf Hitler in the Reichstag, Berlin, January 30th, 1939. Now we see President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was surrounded by Jewish advisors. F.D. Roosevelt was such a pawn, the number of Jews among his 72 advisors was 52. There we see his remedy to the Depression was bringing in many socialistic conditions in America and destroying many freedoms. And there we see the American note, which was printed in his time, with the all-seeing eye of Illuminati. Remember, creating wars, creating depressions, and always selling the remedy which put us further into their clutches. Here we see Father Coughlin, so-called. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he wrote this book, which I have got a copy of. That's the picture of it. The Money, Questions and Answers. He shows that the Federal Reserve System that the Jewish bankers set up in 1914 and are making today billions and billions of dollars, which they use in interest and taxation from the people, that they created money out of thin air to loan the government their money when the government had the right under the Constitution to create the money itself. Well, Coughlin stirred up many Americans against the Jewish money power on Wall Street. But then the Wall Street bankers got the government to turn the tax department on the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church shrunk back very quickly. He spoke against the monopolies, the big petrol companies, the big telephone companies, the money lenders. He accused them of many things, and they were wrong. They were obvious evils. But it didn't cover the mistakes in the Catholic Church. It didn't make the Catholic Church right, because they recognized obvious evils. Here we see that God condemns monopolies. Woe unto them that join house to house and lay field to field, till there be no place that they may be placed alone in the midst of the earth. Here we see the Second World War came about, as Hitler said might happen. And there's a German poster showing the Jews. You can see the nose, the Jews, and it's got England is in the grip of the Jewish money power. And that's why England didn't want to go to war with the English. But there we see the Jew resisting and the Germans trying to do something about it. General von Rundstedt, one of Germany's great generals, Hitler's orders spear British army at Dunkirk in 1940. Marshal von Rundstedt stated his astonishment that Hitler had ordered the German army to halt before the annihilation of the British army at Dunkirk. Von Rundstedt stated, Hitler then astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire. He compared the British Empire with the Catholic Church, saying they were both essential elements of stability in the world, pawns in the game. They could have finished the British army off at Dunkirk, but Hitler said that the British are our cousins and we want them on our side to fight against Bolshevism, a common enemy. And also with Pearl Harbor, America once again didn't want to get into the war, but they were drawn into the war because their battleships were deliberately left tied up at Pearl Harbor. And 85% of the people didn't want to go to war the day before Pearl Harbor. But the day after Pearl Harbor, 85% of American people, their public opinion had been changed. And the bankers were able to draw America into the war. The name of the game was get all the nations in fighting and killing each other. And when they were all maimed and dead, the survivors, you talk them into joining the United Nations or some power which they control, hence taking their freedoms off them. Here we see that predictably Hitler started rounding up the Jews, all Jews. Now, how could these poor creatures and the little children be a hindrance to Europe? But what they did, you can see the dead bodies here. The German nation and Austria and Spain reacted to the power of the Jewish money power and the fact that all the wealthy people in Germany were Jews, and they started executing. This man has got a pistol and he's about to shoot. Here's the German army watching on as this man is about to die and topple into the pit. And they were rounded up and stars were put on them, the same as the Catholic Church and the papacy puts yellow stars on the Jews in years gone by. And here we saw this one last night, the German army executing, shooting people, civilians, throwing them in the ditches. And here's Kurt Waldheim, the former director of the United Nations. The United Nations, was it? He's a good Roman Catholic. There he is in his Nazi uniform in Yugoslavia. He's a friend of the Pope. The Pope has made him a papal knight. The crime at Caton Wood, here's one of the heads with a revolver shot in it. The Jewish-controlled KGB exterminated Polish army officers at Caton Wood. After the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which split Poland in two in 1940 or 39, we see that all the Polish army officers that were carted into Russia were executed. So it appears that not only did the Jews organise and carry out the Caton Wood mass murders, but that through Robert Kempner, the American public prosecutor at Nuremberg, they tried to conceal the truth from the world. Thus, in a few days or perhaps in a few hours, they exterminated the elite, the Roman Catholics of the Polish nation, and with it many of the intellectual class. They were all reserve officers, and the communists knew that part of the international Jewish bankers' plans was that all of Eastern Europe would go to the communists after the Second World War. And they thought it would be easier to take over Poland with the intelligentsia of all the army officers, 17,000 of them executed. And here we see that Germany was peppered into defeat. There's one of the cities of Germany completely ruined. One of the reasons for bombing these cities was it was good for the bankers to destroy them, and then the people that survived had to go into debt to them in order to rebuild the cities. Do you follow me? Keep the people in debt, keep them in agitation against each other. So as the communist forces pushed through from From the east, Russia controlled and took all of Eastern Europe. We had the atom bomb, but after the war we could have said to Stalin here, we'll give you till tomorrow, Joe, to get out of Eastern Europe, or we'll drop a bomb on you. But no, they didn't, because the international bankers were ruling them all. And it was a big show in order for the remedy to be sold to us. Sadly, many thousands, 20,000 American and British prisoners of war, the Russians, they were in German prisoner of war camps, but they were released by the Russians, and the Russians never let them go home. They took them into Russia and put them into concentration camps out in the east. And the news has only recently got through to the west. There's some more of them. There's some Americans that they know are in captivity. There we see Eisenhower sold them out. He was a traitor. And there's the book that I've got on the subject called Soldiers of Misfortune, where thousands and thousands of Allied soldiers released from German prisoner of war camps by the Russians. They were not allowed to go home. They were shipped into Russia as slaves. Results of the Second World War. Just the same as the First World War. The youth of the Christian nations dead and maimed. Christian nations in huge debt to the Jewish bankers. Eastern Europe goes to the communists with no vote. And while we had the atom bomb, the United Nations formed to control all nations as a remedy. The IMF was made to control the nation's finances, and the World Bank formed to loan to the nations. And Israel becomes a nation for the Jews. And anti-Semitism becomes a hate crime. Now we see the United Nations is formed, but Jewish international bankers behind the United Nations. The Jew, Alger Hiss, who was convicted of perjury in the United States for denying he was a communist, was the first Secretary General of the United Nations. Conspiracy to destroy the Christian West. The United Nations is a Jewish idea. Ben-Gurion, he was the first Prime Minister of Israel. What is that Jewish idea? That Jewish idea is that all the people of the world would be controlled by the chosen race, the Jews. The Jews would have the promised land, Palestine, and the Jews would rule the world through socialism or communism, and we would all be kept down as slaves. The plaque at the United Nations, there is all the flags of the nations. There is a deceptive call for peace and safety. For when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Here we see the United Nations peace dove being weighed down with guns and machine guns and grenades. It's meant to be a peace organisation, but there it is, the United Nations, but it's been involved in about 50 wars, where they've been used by the international financiers to further pushing nations into control of the United Nations. Then we see the Berlin Wall went up. Polish communists were Jews. On the other side of the Berlin Wall, Polish Archbishop, during his visit to America in 1946, emphatically stated that the majority of the Polish Communist Party consisted of Jews who ruthlessly terrorized Poland. And that happened in Hungary. And here's Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel. And here are the Israelites, so-called, moving into the so-called Promised Land. A Jewish author explains the enigma of Israel. Here they are at the United Nations. There is Hopkins, Harry Hopkins. He's a Jew, and he's in a high position in the American government. And here he's now representing the Israel delegation at the United Nations when it became a nation. In 1948, when Israel was formed itself into a state, the Russians and the Americans, the super antagonists, so-called, joined hands together. They acted as midwives in the act of the birth of Israel. That's Isaac Dietrich, Stalin's Jewish biographer, in The Zionist Factor by Ivan Benson. Here we see after that, we saw the Korean War on the peninsula, where MacArthur was sacked because he was going to win the war for the West. The Catholic Church was involved in pushing America in there, but the big international Jewish financiers got MacArthur sacked, the same as they kept him out of Europe in the Second World War. He was the most distinguished general the United States had, but they put Eisenhower in there, and he knew their plans and he was subservient to them. and that was that the Allied army would creep into Europe, and it would do that in such a way that all of the Russians could get all the way in from the east and take over all of Eastern Europe, which was one of their goals. Here we see the Rosenbergs, a Jewish couple who stole the American atom bomb secrets for Russia, and they were executed as traitors in the electric chair. Here we see Elgar Hiss, another Jew who was the architect of the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. He was jailed for perjury, by Richard Nixon. He nailed him because he was a communist, and communism really is the Jewish plan for us. Joseph McCarthy, the Catholic-controlled, educated American senator, went out after these people. And I heard on the radio recently they made snide remarks about him that there was a red under every bed. Well, there was a red Jew under every bed. And Senator McCarthy, he made the special Cox inquiry. He led it in the United States Senate to inquire into the red subversion in America. But Senator McCarthy has died in the most mysterious and suspicious circumstances. Several American papers hinted openly that he was murdered. So they got rid of him. Then we see what happened, the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Cardinal Mindszenty was part of that. They were all anti-communist. Cardinal Mindszenty was a Nazi, and they sadly got hold of, they got the brunt of the Russian army, and they were ruthlessly butchered. And the West allowed it to happen. Then the Catholic Church was behind the Vietnam War to stop the communist advance in Asia. Remember these two powers, Catholicism and communism. And the arm of America went in there, but many of the New World Order boys were not on the side of winning in Vietnam. That's why America never won there, because it was just another big game where the bankers would finance all this equipment and lives were lost, and they couldn't care less about that. Here we see in Czechoslovakia in '68 the big uprising which was ruthlessly put down. Then we saw when Khrushchev and Nixon were meant to meet over to try and thaw the Cold War, we see Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 plane. It was meant to be shot down. Why? To keep the Cold War going, so the big armament factories and the ammunition factories will make billions of dollars. The big financiers don't want peace. Now, they said it was shot down by a Russian rocket. My research shows that there was a time bomb put on the plane. I don't want to go into that at this time, but my research shows that there was a time bomb put on the plane, and 3 hours into Russia it went down, and it heated up the Cold War again, which was beneficial. Then we see communism continuing to force its way down into Africa. We see the Jew Henry Kissinger looking over the shoulder of Ian Smith. Soon after that, Rhodesia fell. We see here Henry Kissinger looking over the shoulder of the Shah of Iran. Shortly afterwards, he got cancer. His friend Henry Kissinger put him in, the Jew, Secretary of State, put him in hospital in New York. And I would make this observation: if he didn't have cancer when he went into hospital, he certainly had it when he came out. And they got rid of him, and part of their plan for world. Then they shot President Kennedy. President Kennedy was a good Catholic, but what he planned to do was touch the Federal Reserve, the one that Father Coughlin had spoken about. He planned to take it over by the American government and stop the American people being ripped off. But they got to him and disposed of him. Many people believe the reason his wife was climbing out of the back of the vehicle was because the driver over here had shot President Kennedy under the arm. He was paid off to do so. The great judgment of God will find out exactly. Then the communist revolution took over China, and it went into Afghanistan and into Africa. But then something happened. The great communist Russian army got bogged down with the Muslims in Afghanistan, and they started the Great Withdrawal. The first time in many centuries, or in many decades, that communism was on the back foot. Someone was out to destroy communism. Then we see the Berlin Wall, the Wall of Shame. It started to come down, didn't it? We're going to see on one of the nights just how it came down. how the people rose up behind there. They never ever voted for communism in the first place. They had it forced upon them by the international bankers. And then we see the Russian tanks all packing up, thousands and thousands of tanks packed up to go home as the people revolted onto the streets of Europe. And here in Russia, as Russia fell also, the communists, here's the Russian soldiers going home. And here we see the ugly side of glasnost as racist opinion surfaces. Russians in a Pamyot meeting openly spoke about their hatred of Jews. All of Eastern Europe hated the Jews because the Jews were suppressing them through the international financiers. I felt as if I'd attended a real fascist meeting of the 1930s. We go with the massive debt that the world is facing. Here are some Time magazine covers showing that the debt bomb, that one day all the debt of the world is going to explode. Here we see the debt mounting into billions and billions of dollars, but nobody ever asks who owns that debt. We're all paying interest out of our taxes on this money, which the government has incurred in the form of debt, but nobody is allowed to know, and they're not taught at school, who owns that debt. Well, the international magicians, the international bankers, own the debt of all the world. And the money comes into circulation in the form of an overdraft or debt. So if you paid all the debt off in the world, there'd be no money left in circulation. So we have inherited this corrupt money system, obviously from Pandora's box, as one cynic said, and our very standard of living is subject to being taxed to the point not to provide hospitals or roads or arms for protection, but to first serve the national debt, which bankers just wrote out cheques for billions of dollars and gave it to the government. Throughout history there were some men that opposed them. Napoleon issued his own credit. So did Abraham Lincoln. So did the early settlers into America. And so did Adolf Hitler. He created his own money. That's how he made Germany into the most powerful nation in the world in 5 years. He got on top of the Jewish bankers. And the Jew bankers, they're mainly Jews, and I'm not anti-Semitic, but it's a fact, and no one can deny it, that if you do some research, that the international bankers control the debts of the nation. And they hold back the cookies from people who don't do as they're told. So when they give you loans, they commit every nation to export and import, so we're not self-sufficient, so we have to get their debt, and we have to service it out of our taxation. So here we go, the problem of the debt. Then we see Carter-verse inflation. Discipline, discipline, discipline. And we see the Illuminati and the all-seeing eye here. The eye of light, so-called. And here we see in this going, gone, this arc panorama, we see the all-seeing eye slipped in here on the Time cover. Then we see the squeeze of 79, we're bamboozled by their ups and downs in the economy and devaluation and all this. And here we see the Federal Reserve Governor, Paul Volcker. He's a Jew. Here we see the new Mr. Dollar, Alan Greenspan. He's another Jew. He's in charge of the most powerfulest and largest bank in the world. He dictates interest rates in America, and he can control the American livelihood through the economy through interest rates and credit. We then have another Jew, Soros, who has been wrecking the Asian economies. And here is Soros and Greenspan getting together, and Greenspan, they believe, gave Soros inside information on interest rates and credit, and he benefited to the tune of billions. But we can see that George Soros, the Jews' dealings in Russia, have been probed by the Russian government. Here we see that Alan Greenspan caused the downturn in the Asian financial collapse. And here he is trying to invest in Seoul. But they collapsed the currencies of Asia before they bought up all the investments very cheap. That's a standard practice of the bankers. Then we see Soros calls for an end to robber capitalism. Well, George Soros is one of the biggest capitalist robbers going. Here's what he's saying: I'll break the Bank of England. What arrogance. Billionaire Soros warns Britain over the euro. He's saying that they should go into euro, and if they don't, he'll break the Bank of England. What arrogance. Here we see Soros warns of credit crunch. He's saying that if there is going to be problems, then we must sort it out, and the remedy is sold in the form of one big world bank where they would control it, of course. Now we see here that George Soros asked the United States Congress for a loan of $18 billion to pay or to loan to certain African nations. And people in the media said that George Soros was a wonderful, kind man for going to bat for the African nations who owed the Wall Street bankers $18 billion. But if you follow the small print through, you will see who did the African nations owe the $18 billion to? George Soros and his international bankers' friends. So they got $18 billion from the American taxpayers, who gave it to the Africans who never saw it. It went straight back into their pocket. Then we see, why is this man smiling? Alan Greenspan, he's just put up the interest rates in America. Here we see another Jew by the name of Rubin, who's the Secretary of the Treasury in America. Then we see Madeleine Albright. She is a Jew and she's in Secretary of State. And here we see Cohen, another Jew, is in charge of the Secretary of Defense. And here we see the Committee to Save the World. All Jews, the banking men of the world. Here we see the sad end for the banking heir. Amschel Rothschild, he was found dead in a hotel in Paris, and he was the head of the Rothschild Banking Trust, who loaned money to Soros and other energetic Jews who went out and wheel and dealed in the world economy. We saw that the Jewish bankers state that we cannot stop a world government. We shall have world government whether or not we like it. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by conquest or consent. James P. Warburg, Jewish international banker, speaking to the US Senate on February the 17th, 1950. And here the Time magazine is telling us, look, reform and join the United Nations or die. The world will die. Well, that's not necessarily the case, but they're telling us if we don't join, we will die. A Jew declares their goal for world dominion. The Jews have a right to subordinate to themselves the rest of mankind and to be masters over the whole earth. This is the historic destiny of the Jew. Harold Watton, Ashkenazim Jew in New York, 1939. Now we see Fidel Castro is calling for a new world order. Well, many politicians are doing that. Here we see some people are opposing the New World Order here. That the World Trade Organization, the IMF and the World Bank. More world, less bank. Break the chains of the IMF. These Americans are trying to break what the international financiers through Gore and Bush and the present president, they're trying to bring the New World Order out, and these men are their front men. Okay? We see here in Russia, this gentleman, Russia's Vladimir Zhirinovich. It's the rise of a rebel-rouser. Why is the media turning on him as a rebel-rouser? Why? Because he made this statement to Time magazine on December the 27th, 1993, page 15. I will never agree with the situation where 2 million Russian Jews rule a country where another 150 million Russians simply have to obey them. That's been the case ever since the Russian Revolution. Then we see here Mahatma in Malaysia, because of George Soros trying to bankrupt the Asian economy. Here Mahatma Mohamad, the Prime Minister or President of Malaysia, the Prime Minister, stood up against them. And he lashed the Jews for their corrupt financial dealings as parasites by trying to take over all these nations. So he froze their assets. But then they put pressure on him, and Malaysian Prime Minister denies alleging a Jewish plot. He had to take the words back. Here we see George Washington. Washington opposed Jews entering America. I agree fully with General Washington that we must protect this young nation from an insidious influence and penetration that gentleman is the Jew. If you do not exclude them from these United States, in this Constitution, in less than 200 years they will dominate and devour the land. Your children will curse you in your graves. from the diary of Charles Pinckney, member of the Constitutional Convention from South Carolina, taken from the Rothschild's Money Trust book by George Armstrong, who was a United States Senator. And that was the same, you might remember, from the previous slides, that in Russia, the Russians were controlled, the Jews owned everything. Then we see in Central America, we see, they knew, here we see the church as the Nazis, and here we see Zionimo. That's how they say Zionism. So we see Uncle Sam as Zionism, so people in Central America and some of these poverty-stricken nations were against the Jewish financiers on Wall Street. Why? Because they're big-owned businesses like McDonald's or so, take all the best prime land in Nicaragua and run fat cattle there, and the poor people are starving there while the beef goes off to feed fat Americans. It's not justice, but I'm not getting into that tonight. Here is a Dutch magazine where there is reporting on anti-Semitism in the Ukraine. Here's two soldiers protecting this Jew in Russia who's reading his Talmud. Pius XII meant here the Vatican held the loot. Here's an amazing heading. This was one of the first reports that actually implicated in a respectable newspaper that the Vatican held during the war a lot of the Jewish loot that was stolen. When the Catholic Church reacted by putting all the people in the death camps, and the Jews now want Swiss bank to pay $2.4 billion for lost assets. The Jewish money power now putting pressure on the Swiss banks to pay out to the Jewish people some of their lost treasures. In Israel, we see them talking peace, Arafat and the then Prime Minister of Israel talking about how they could live together, and the bombs maiming people, and the murder goes on. Jew is killing Arab and Arab is killing Jew. And here, as Baruch Mazal said, it is only a matter of time until there is a war, and it will start right here. We see the Jews against the Arabs, the Fijians against the Fijian Indians, and this is what Yasser Sharam said, let there be no doubt. Israel will also know how to defend herself in the future and defeat the evil designs of its enemies. How does that come about? Because the Jewish bankers on Wall Street have provided literally billions and billions of dollars every year of American taxpayers' money to go to provide arms for Israel, and the best airplanes and the best and most modern equipment. Now we see Zionism is the most stupendous fallacy in Jewish history. It is wrong in principle and impossible of realization. It is unsound in its politics and sterile in its spiritual ideals. I speak as a Jew. Henry Morgenthau. And then the Arabs or the Muslims said, I swear to God, we will let our fire eat half of Israel if it tries to wage anything against Iraq. Well, they found out different, didn't they? And here we see the Arab bombings of people being maimed and destroyed on the buses in Jerusalem and other parts. And here we see in Israel a scrap between the Jews. Who are these Jews? Here is a black Jew from Africa about to punch this brown Jew or an olive-skinned Jew. So the Jews are not one race of people, because many Africans have chosen the Jewish religion. So there's no bloodline where they can say they're physically superior to anyone in the world. What happened in that picture, incidentally, if you could go back on that one there, Gabe, please, we see that the Jews had been collecting blood, or the black African Jews had been giving their blood for blood donating in the hospitals of Israel, but unknown to them and secretly, the white Jews had been tipping it down the sink because they felt their blood was worthless and contaminated. And so these people reacted in this riot against, and the Jewish police put the other Jews in their place. Go one forward on that one, thank you. Now, the wanderings of the Jews. Unbelieving Jews to be scattered into all the world, and I will deliver them to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt, to be a reproach and a proverb, a taunt and a curse in all places whither I shall drive them. Jeremiah 24:9. And so it was that when the Jews were obedient, God blessed them. When they were disobedient, their nation fell. Here we see Arthur Koestler, a famous author, He wrote the book, The 13th Tribe. He's died suspiciously since. He showed that most Jews, 85% of those in Russia today, have no racial connection with Palestine whatsoever. They were Khazar Jews, and they were converted to the Jewish faith from southern Russia. Rabbis were travelling through southern Russia, and they were converted to the Jewish faith about 900 AD. Their real racial connection were Turkish Mongolian, and they accepted the Jewish religion. And from there, when the Russians defeated them sometime after AD 1000, they fled up into Hungary and up into Poland, and here they became the Ashkenazim, and the Ashkenazim dark-skinned and dark-eyed Jew. The true Jew that does have some racial connection with his ancestors in Palestine are called the Sephardic Jew, and they are blue-eyed and make up about 15% of the Jews today. The Jewish authorities state that Edom is in modern Israel. The Jewish Encyclopedia says Edom is in modern Israel. This is a reference to the southern Russian Ashkenazim Khazars, who were Turkish Mongolian by race, with no blood connection to Palestine. The Khazar Empire was converted to Judaism about 900 AD by Jewish rabbis using the perverted Babylonian Talmud. These impostor Jews make up the majority who claim to be Jews today and want to immigrate back to Palestine. Many people believe that the argument between Esau and Jacob is still going on, and that these Jews from southern Russia are related to the seed of Esau, and that they want their birthright back, which Jacob took by fraud. Here we see Judaism and the Vatican, that they're bringing the liberalism in through the Jesuits and through Pope John the 23rd. And here we see the hoax of the 20th century. Some people believe that there wasn't 6 million Jews killed. I don't believe there was 6 million killed, but I believe many were killed in the terrible reaction to the international Jewish financiers and their revolutions by Hitler. There was a reason why Hitler did what he did. Freemasonry run by Jews in the Vatican. Leon de Ponce wrote that. Some professed Jews are from the synagogue of Satan, so the Bible says in Revelation 2:9. I know thy works and tribulations and poverty, but thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Satan deceives the whole world, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Revelation 12:9. What I'm talking about to you tonight, friends, is not new. There have been many books written throughout history on the very subject that I'm talking about. Here's one by Roy Livesey, Understanding the New World Order. Here's one on the Illuminati 666. Here's one by the famous American evangelist Pat Robertson, The New World Order. And so it goes on. Here we see now that the Jews are doing a deal with the Vatican. Paris tells Pope Jerusalem should be under Vatican control. And here we see Israel and the Vatican sign an agreement. Communism came to a stop in Afghanistan and other places around the world. And here we see now the Pope with his two-fingered hand sign. And here we see Catholic soldiers, German soldiers that came back out of the Russian prisoner of war camps where they were in. They were kept in Russia after the war for about till 1955, and then they were returned to their families in Germany. And you can see them all giving the Nazi sign, and you can see the Pope giving the official hand sign of the two fingers. And here we see the Pope with Kurt Waldheim, who was a Nazi and responsible for executing German or British paratroopers during the Second World War. That didn't worry Kurt, and he's now been made a papal knight by the Pope. So when the Pope is talking about peace and justice, the Catholic Church, as we're going to find out in some of the other talks, brought down communism. This great battle between communism and Freemasonry and the Jewish money power and communism has come to a halt, and the Catholic Church is waging the war and gaining the ascendancy. So when the Pope talks about justice and peace, be not deceived. He's making a saint out of Cardinal Stepanek, who was jailed for 16 years after the Second World War for his part in the genocide of 700,000 Serb Orthodox. And here we see Cardinal Mindszenty of Poland, another Nazi. He's been made a saint by the present Pope. He was a Nazi, or Wyszynski rather, and there's Mindszenty there. And even in our own countries, we see in Australia the vilification bill, the media says, belongs to the days of the Inquisition, where they could burn your books and crash into your house without notice. Once upon a time, an Englishman's house was his castle. No one could come in, but now the police, under a variety of different excuses, can crash in. Here we see the purple and gold of Rome, and the woman was arrayed in purple, a woman is a church, and scarlet, and bedecked with gold and precious stones, having a golden cup of abomination and filthiness of her fornication. Revelation 7:4. Here we see the gold and the scarlet, the purple, exactly as the Bible said. And here we see the golden cup, and all the world wandering after the beast. Here we see the gold and the red and the purple. And upon her head was a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abomination of the earth. Revelation 17:5. Here we see, and the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. There we see the Vatican ruling over the kings of the earth. Then we see, yea, the time cometh that whosoever killeth you thinks that he doeth God's service. Many historians know that the Vatican, the Catholic system, popery, has killed upwards of 100 million people throughout history, those people that disagreed with them. And yet Jesus Christ said in the Bible, harm no man. And here we see the Vatican gives official approval of the death penalty. Here we see, and I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And in her was found the blood of prophets, and of saints, and all that were slain upon the earth. Here are Protestants being hung by the neck in the Netherlands. But whosoever shall offend one of these little ones, of which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone was hung about his neck, and that he was drowned in the depths of the sea. Here is a smouldering stake with bones underneath it, and here's a little child hunting for his mother. His mother has just been burnt at the stake in Holland during the Reformation for disagreeing with the unbiblical doctrines of the Catholic Church. Here we see, and here is the mind which hath wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. Everybody knows that Rome sits on 7 hills. Then we see, and all the world wondered after the beast. The Vatican asserts authority over conscience now. It's brought in the death penalty, and it says it has the right to usurp its authority over your conscience. And then we have, the Bible identifies Rome as the woman who reigneth over kings. And the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. Here's the Pope meeting Gorbachev, and shortly afterwards Gorbachev brought Russia, or the Vatican brought communism down. Now we know that communism was bad, and the people suffered under it. But the remedy they were getting to their ailment, Catholicism, I'm going to show you is worse. Here we see good Catholics must obey the Pope over the Emperor. If the emperors command one thing and the Pope another, men, that's Catholics, must ignore the emperor and obey the Pope as the Vicar of Christ. There we see that Catholics who join Masonic secret societies commit a grave sin. Catholics who join Masonic associations commit a grave sin and cannot continue Holy Communion. The negative judgment of the Church remains unchanged in regard to Masonic associations, because their principles have always been considered irreconcilable with the doctrines of the Church, and because membership in them remains prohibited. Cardinal Ratzinger, director of the congregation, that is today's Inquisition. Here we see the Pope giving a speech. The Inquisition, friends, is about to come again. The Pope was also under fire because the Longchamp Mass falls on the anniversary of the 1572 Bartholomew's Day massacre of Protestants by French Catholics, in which 3,000 Huguenots were slaughtered in the previous slides, that there is confusion in Israel to who is a Jew. We saw previous pictures from Time magazine showing that many of the Jews in Israel today are Africans, but they believe in the Jewish religion. We saw a vast number of them are what you call Ashkenazim Jews from southern Russia and have no racial connections with Palestine whatsoever. Some of the Palestinians and the Arabs, through the seed of Abraham, they might have more claim to Palestine on a bloodline. So it's actually a religion that claims Israel. But we make this statement that the Jews are the chosen people of God. But the parents of the Jews were Gentiles. This is what the Bible says in Ezekiel 16:3. And I say thus, saith the Lord God unto Jerusalem, Thy birth and thy nativity is of the land of Canaan. Thy father was an Amorite, and thy mother an Hittite. So they were only Gentiles that the Lord took to make a people out of. And God's promises to the Jews are always conditional. And it shall come to pass that as the Lord rejoiced over you to do you good and to multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and to bring you to naught, and ye shall be plucked from off the land whither thou goest to possess it. Deuteronomy 28, verse 63. Now we see Jews were committed the oracles of God. What vantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. That means they had the Old Testament, so they knew what God required of them. Romans 3, 1 and 2. Here we see in the Old Testament dozens and dozens of texts that clearly show that Jesus was the Messiah. Here we see that Isaiah prophesied the Saviour would be born of a virgin. Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and he shall call his name Emmanuel. Isaiah 7:14. Also see here in Micah 5:2, one of the Jewish Old Testament books, But thou, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me that is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forth have been from old, from everlasting. So we see he'd be born of a virgin, he'd be born in Bethlehem, and here we see that God, in Daniel 9:24 to 26, he gave a time prophecy when the Lord would arise. And 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression and to make an end of sins. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolation are determined. We know that this 490-year prophecy of 70 weeks, 70 times 7 is 490 prophetic years, we know that that started in 457 BC according to the Pear's Dictionary of Events, although it has been mysteriously changed in the more modern copies of this document. But 457 was the return of the Jews under Ezra from their exile. And at that time, God had given them 490 years to welcome in the Messiah, but they killed him instead. And here we see the time prophecies of 7 weeks for the building of Jerusalem, and then we see the last week, which many futurists put at the end of Earth's history, away down here. They have no right to take it off the 490 years. Here we see that last week, in the midst of the week, Christ died for our sins. And after 62 weeks shall the Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. God never gave any unconditional promises to anybody. He didn't give it to you and I, and he didn't give it to the Jews. And they killed the Messiah, and so did we in a sense with our sins, so they can't be blamed alone for that. But they did it, and the crowd called crucify him because the church leaders urged him on. And yet 100 texts, maybe more, from their Bible, the Old Testament, which they accept, pointed to Jesus Christ being the Messiah. It says in Isaiah chapter 53 that when he came, he would be rejected by the people. And here is a prophecy in Zechariah 11:10-13. And I took my staff, even beauty, and cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant which I have made with all the people. And it was broken in that day, and so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. And I said unto them, if ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price, that I was prized of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. The Lord had a prophecy from Zechariah, one of the Jewish books, that when the Messiah came, he would be rejected, but he would be accepted by the common people. And here we see the common people receiving Jesus Christ gladly, and the little children. But the leaders of the church rejected him as an impostor and said that he was of their father, his father the devil. And yet here we see also the great prophecy that he would be sold for 30 pieces of silver. And that's exactly, friends, what happened. And here we see that Christ would enter Jerusalem on an ass. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Zechariah 9:9. And there is Jesus coming into Jerusalem. Isaiah prophesied Jewry would reject Christ. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid our faces from him. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquities of us all. There is Christ not using an army to force people to follow him. He subjected to the humiliation of the cross. Isaiah prophesied that Christ would be smitten. Isaiah 55:6. The Lord God hath opened mine ear, and I was not rebellious, neither turned away back. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. That's exactly what happened to Christ. Here we see Isaiah prophesies that Christ would hold his peace. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Isaiah 53:7. He opened not his mouth to defend himself. And here we see that being fulfilled in Matthew 26:63. But Jesus held his peace, and the high priest answered and said unto him, I abjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou art the Christ, the Son of God. Zechariah foretold the sale of Jesus. And the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price, that I was prized of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Zechariah 11:13. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, repented himself and bought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, and they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field. This amazing prophecy was foretold by the Lord who knows all things. And there's the 30 pieces of silver on the floor, Matthew 27:3-7. And the leaders of the church looked in the rule book, and they bought a potter's field with it. Isaiah prophesied Christ's death for our sins. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Isaiah 53:5. There is Christ collapsing under the weight of the cross and being attacked and smitten and urged on. Lots would be cast for Christ's clothing. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots for my vesture. Here we see in Matthew 27:35, in fulfillment of this Old Testament prophecy, told hundreds of years beforehand, and they crucified him and parted his garments, casting lots, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet. They parted my garments among them, and upon my vesture they did cast lots. The Roman soldiers cast lots for Christ's garments. Zechariah prophesied of Christ's wounds, and one shall say unto him, What are these wounds in thy hands? Then he shall answer, Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. That's Israel. Zechariah 13:6. And then we see David prophesied darkness at the cross. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears. He bowed the heavens also and came down, and darkness was under his feet. Psalms 18:6-9. When the Lord died at Calvary for you and I, darkness came upon the world. Then we see something else was prophesied in Psalms 18:6 and 7, hundreds of years before it happened. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations also of the hills moved, and were shaken because he was wroth. That's when there was a great darkness you saw on the previous slide, and then there was a terrible earthquake. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake and the rocks rent. Matthew 27:51. Zechariah prophesied that Christ would be looked upon on the cross. And they shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him, as one mourneth for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him, as one that is in bitterness for his firstborn. Zechariah 12:10. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. The Jews rejected Christ as their Messiah. Unbelieving Jews claimed Caesar as their king. Pilate said unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. John 19:15. Unbelieving Jews called Christ's blood upon themselves. Then answered all the people and said, His blood be on us and on our children. Matthew 27:25. Christ wept over Jerusalem, for he saw this very prophecy from their own lips come true. Jews reject Christ, so disciples go to the Gentiles. Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold and said it was necessary that the word of God should first have been spoken to you. But seeing you have put it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. Acts 13:46. Then we see Christ rejects the unbelieving Jewish nation. They rejected Christ, so he rejected them. Every Old Testament prophecy was conditional. Nobody ever got any unconditional prophecies. And what happened in AD 70? Jerusalem burned, and 1.2 million Jews were destroyed and murdered by the Romans. Christ says Jews of their father the devil. Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. John 8:44. The kingdom of Israel is taken from disobedient Israel. Therefore say I unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you, and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. Matthew 21:43. And here we see the Holy Spirit falling upon the disciples at Pentecost. And they were all Jews. So not all Jews rejected this message. A small percentage of them accepted Christ. They were the poorer classes, accepted Christ, and the Holy Spirit fell upon them while Jerusalem was destroyed, the unbelieving Jews. Then we see Jesus prophesied the soon destruction of the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the building of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things, the temple? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. Matthew 24:1 and 2. Moses prophesied the downfall of Jerusalem. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, throughout all thy land which the Lord thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, that's their children, the flesh of thy sons and thy daughters, which the Lord thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee. That was Deuteronomy 28:52 and 53, when Moses told the people of Israel the blessings when they were obedient and the cursings when they were disobedient. And that prophecy was fulfilled in AD 70 when Titus and the Roman legions killed 1.2 million Jews who disbelieved in Jesus Christ. Jews would be scattered if disobedient, and I will deliver them to be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth for their hurt, to be a reproach and a proverb, a taunt and a curse, in all places whither I shall drive them. And here's the great carving on the gates at Rome of the instruments from the Jewish temple being carted off by captives back to Rome. Then we see the unbelieving Jews are cut off, Matthew 23:37 and 38. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee. How often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Christ was prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed because their only protection was Christ, and they rejected him as an impostor, but not all Jews did. Then we saw about 135 AD the tragedy of Masada, where the Jews were in that little cubbyhole there, and the Romans came up the mountain, and they found the whole lot of them had cut each other's throats. The men cut their children's throats and their wives' throats. They would rather die than go into Roman captivity. Here we see Luther warns of Jewish usury. That's Martin Luther, the great priest who became a founder of the Protestant movement by putting the Bible ahead of the Catholic traditions. People say that Jews have large sums of money and are therefore useful to the rulers. But from where did they take this money? Not from their own belongings, but from the property of the rulers and their subjects, from whom they have stolen and robbed the money by usury. Have the Jews not every cause to laugh at us and ridicule us for letting ourselves be so ignominiously cheated and duped, for giving our money and letting them remain in our country to practice their treachery? And so the pogroms went on. The prophecy of Jeremiah 24:9 said that the Jews would be scattered around the world. They had rejected Christ, their only strength and their only their protection, and yet they were hated. And the pogroms, here are two about to be burnt at the stake, and the Pope looks on. Here are the pogroms in Russia, in Germany, all over the world there were pogroms. Here we see some in Germany, Frankfurt, where Jewish houses are being destroyed. Here is pillaging a Jewish house somewhere in Europe. Here we see Hitler carrying on the principles of the Catholic Church, where they are taking apart. Here we see the German soldiers rounding up these kids and the Jewish people. Here we see they said, let his blood be what? On us and on our children. And that certainly has come true. The Old Testament prophecy said that Jesus was the Messiah. The Jews rejected him to this day. They believe he's an impostor. But their own book tells us clearly that Jesus was the Messiah. Here we see the Jews at the Wailing Wall, but they've missed Christ. The Jewish disciples take the gospel to the world. They went out to all the world, and all believers are now spiritual Israel. Here we see, if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Galatians 3:29. What does that mean? That means if you're a Chinaman or an African or an Australian or a New Zealander, then it doesn't matter what your blood is. We're all God's children. If we accept Jesus Christ, we are then an adopted Jew, and just as much a Jew as Jesus was or Abraham was. And here we see, but as many as receive him, to them gave he what? Power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. John 1:12. All the different people of the world who accept Jesus Christ, the greatest Jew that ever lived, become spiritual Jews, while these Jews that are in Israel that come from Africa and southern Russia and are killing Arabs and Arabs killing them are lost in darkness. All believers are now spiritual Israel. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, an holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvellous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Isn't that wonderful? 1 Peter 2:9 and 10 shows that we are now, if we believe in Jesus Christ, whether we're Red Indians or Africans or what, we are the spiritual children of God in Israel. Disobedient Jews are cut off, and Christ's followers become Israel. Because of unbelief, they, unbelieving Jews, were broken off. Now thou standest by faith. But be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell. Severity, but towards thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. So on what condition can the Jews be grafted in again? They must believe in Jesus Christ. Whether they immigrate to Palestine or stay in the nations where they were scattered is irrelevant. The point is that if they're to be grafted back in to spiritual Israel, it is on the basis of accepting Jesus Christ. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, the Gentiles, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these which be the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? And so we see now no difference between Jews and Gentiles, for there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. So that everyone that calls on Jesus Christ is the spiritual Jew. We are not ignorant of Satan's devices, lest Satan should get an advantage of us, for we are not ignorant of his devices. 2 Corinthians 2:11. Hundreds and hundreds of books are being written about the return of the Jews to the promised land. But friends, I believe they're only looking at a small percentage of the full Bible story. The Jews were given another 490 years in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 to 26, to give up their sins and welcome in the Messiah. Most of them rejected him, and God rejected them. They called the blood of the world upon, they said, let his blood be on us and our children. And I believe what we see in the Middle East today is a cunning satanic counterfeit, where even the poor people there, Arabs and Jews, are fighting each other, but they should look up to Christ, the greatest Jew that ever lived. Here we see a false cry for peace and safety. Here they are talking of peace, peace, Arabs and Jews, for when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. 1 Thessalonians 5:3. Mary claimed the Antichrist will be a Jew. Our Blessed Mother at La Salette spoke about the Antichrist. It will be during that time that the Antichrist will be born of a Hebrew nun, a false virgin who will communicate with the old serpent, the master of impurity. That's the Thunders of Justice 2:59. Many of the Christians today believe the Antichrist will be a non-religious Jew. And the Jews are out to control the world. They believe that they are the chosen people of God, and through controlling the money power of the world, they've managed to realize the possession of Palestine for themselves again. But it has been done by their own works and not by the hand of God. They believe and hold in contempt the Arabs and all the Gentiles of the world. They think that they are a lower species of humanity, and therefore they should be controlled by the socialism or the money power and all these things to subject them. The great object of the conspiracy, that's Netanyahu, the former Prime Minister of Israel. The general object of the conspiracy, which the protocols discussed, is the government of the world by a king of the blood of David. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to build up. Unbelieving Jews can be grafted back in if they accept Christ. Here are the Jews. You can see certain characteristics about them. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in, the Jews again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, the Jews, be grafted into their own olive trees? Romans 11:23 and 24. Here we see God is no respecter of persons. That was said to St. Peter in Acts 10:28 to 34. And he said unto them, ye know how that it is an unlawful thing for a man that is a Jew to keep company or come unto one of another nation. But God hath showed me that I should not call any man common or unclean. Then Peter opened his mouth and said, of a truth I perceive that God is no respecter of persons. And here we see all the people of the world, Chinese, Africans, Arabs, all reading the Bible and finding that same wonderful truth, that the greatest Jew that ever lived was Jesus Christ. He fulfilled every Old Testament prophecy which the Jews had. Spiritual Israel will keep the commandment. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. John 14:12. Here we see only the obedient enter the new city Jerusalem. God is not concerned whether you're a Chinaman or Australian or an African or an Indian, or a Jew from Africa or a Jew from southern Russia. He's concerned that people take hold of His strength, claim His sacrifice on Calvary for their guilt and sins, that He bore your sins on Calvary. Blessed are they that do His commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. Revelation 22:14. And here we have, Jesus is knocking at the door of our hearts today. Whether you are of one nation or another nation matters not to the Lord. For the Lord told Peter that He is no respecter of persons. Here is Jesus knocking on the door of our heart. Will we let Him come in tonight? Here we see soon He is to come back. The greatest Jew that ever lived is soon to return for His people, and He will take them, the obedient, from every nation upon earth. I hope and pray, my prayer is that you and I might make that decision to give thy life and heart to Jesus Christ, the greatest Jew that ever lived. For He alone paid the penalty at Calvary for your sins and my sins. And although the Jews were scattered around the world, although most of them rejected Jesus Christ as the Messiah, those that are of their offspring today can be grafted back into that olive tree and accept Jesus Christ. They did say that He was of their father the devil, and they did say that He was, they said, let His blood be on us, on our children. And that prophecy has certainly been fulfilled. But whatever race or nationality we are, we can't help where we came from. But we can certainly make the decision of where we're going. And I hope today that you might study more on how Jesus Christ gave His life for you and for me, that our sins might be taken with Him to Calvary and buried in the depths of the ocean, that we might be the citizens of the new city Jerusalem, wherein dwelleth righteousness, and where all the spiritual Jews from all over the world will spend eternity with Jesus. For the Bible said, ear has not heard, eye has not seen, it has not entered the heart of man, the joys that await for the obedient children of God. I pray that you might make that decision tonight. Thank you for coming.